I usually do the welcomes at church, so a 30-minute welcome. If you've seen some of my welcomes, that would just be like 100 slides of movie quotes, which would be okay, right, for a 30-minute sermon? Good morning. So as Brad said, I'm Tom. This is my first time preaching. I guess this is, like, we're doing this, right, Brad? There's no backing out now. It's happening? Okay. I want to say that Brad asked me to preach, but during one of our Manifest task force meetings, I was Manifest into doing this. I actually think the official minutes of that meeting say that I volunteered, so I was never asked. It's all on me. I actually have done a fair amount of public speaking before. I'm one of the welcomers here at Manifest. When I was preparing for this, I was pretty stressed about trying to flesh out what I was going to talk about. And I had a couple of ideas, but they all felt really forced. I was trying to create a lesson that I thought was scripturally and theologically sound. And that's not how God wants me to speak to you guys this morning. I'm convinced of that. So, fair warning. At Life Group this week, I was sharing some of these feelings, and I was firmly reminded that Paul, who wrote a lot of the letters to the early church, basically a good portion of the New Testament, so a guy who wrote parts of the Bible, didn't write particularly scripturally or theologically focused. He writes about what Jesus has done in his life. He writes about who he was before he found Christ. And he writes about who he is after experiencing a life-changing encounter with the Son of God. That's how I want to speak to you this morning. So a bit of an introduction maybe is important. Who am I? I'm married to Shauna. She's one of the worshipers, one of the singers up here as well. We have two amazing kids, Tommy and Cleo. During the day, I work as an IT security auditor, which basically means that I try and break stuff in my company's network and find flaws, and then I get to write reports and tell other people how to fix it, which is a good job. Sometimes it involves travel. I'm usually pretty vague about the specifics of what I do, which has led to a few of my friends somehow thinking that I'm actually in the CIA. It doesn't help that one of the designations of my profession is Certified Internal Auditor, or CIA. But I have a microphone. I'm going to set the record straight once and for all. I can officially and truthfully state that I can neither confirm nor deny any such allegations. When your friends actually think you're a spy, you let that fantasy live. So, I'm 42 years old. I was an atheist until I was 18, and the story of how I became a Christian is obviously an enormous part of who I am. More importantly, though, it's the best story I have of who God is and what he's done in my life. Even before I met Jesus and gave my life to him. God's done some amazing things in my life. I want to use that experience to speak to you this morning. So with that in mind, I'll give you the title of my sermon, God's a Thief and Doesn't Play Fair. I told you it wasn't going to be theologically sound, right? When I was 17 years old, God stole my bike. It was an awesome bike. It had aluminum wheels, which at the time was considered elite bike technology. It was a mountain bike, so that pretty much I could ride it anywhere, right? It had a cool gel seat for added comfort. It had those handlebar pegs that you could hold on to when going really fast downhill and pretend like you're in the Tour de France. It even had a computer. I could see how fast I was going and how much distance I'd traveled. And it was my primary mode of transportation. I didn't take the bus to school. I rode my bike. I didn't get a ride from my parents when I went to a friend's house or to 7-Eleven. I rode my bike. Pretty much everywhere I went, I was on my bike. And when the snow started to fly in mid-August, I tried to keep riding my bike as much as possible. It was incredibly important to me. And when I was 17, outside of my high school, while I was still in classes in the afternoon in math or social studies, God stole it. And let me say, it was definitely stolen, okay? I locked this thing up with a heavy chain and a padlock. This is before those like D-style bike locks that I now know why they're so popular. And in the spot at my school where I had locked up my bike, there was just one piece of the padlock left, obviously cut by bolt cutters. So not lost, stolen by God. We didn't grow up in a Christian household. We didn't go to church. We didn't say grace. We didn't read the Bible. I actually went to several summer camps in elementary school, and it was at those camps that I learned about Jesus, and I was actually given one of those little red New Testament Bibles. Some of you might be familiar with those little ones, but there's no connection there for me. Our family was basically atheists, so I'm not sure how I ended up at a Christian summer camp. I think maybe we didn't have a lot of money, and so my mom probably just picked a camp that worked in terms of timing and cost, or maybe they had a program that let underprivileged kids attend. I don't know, but I learned about Jesus, but there was no connection there for me. So notice, I wasn't raised a Christian. I didn't believe there even was a God, yet for whatever reason, when my bike was stolen, it was clearly God's fault. I know this because I had a lengthy discussion with my Christian friend, Sean, who walked home with me that day, a considerably longer trip than usual, during which I ranted and raved about how unfair and unjust this act was. I knew Sean believed in God, so I let him have it. How could God let something like this happen? There was no meaning in it. There was no conceivable reason why my bike getting stolen could possibly have any purpose in the universe. If God existed and he was all-powerful, then clearly he let this happen, and I was livid. Sean, to his enormous credit, just listened and empathized, took it all in, and with a small smile on his face. See, he knew something in that moment that I hadn't fully realized and wouldn't for some time. By blaming God, I was in some small way acknowledging that there might be a God. I love the book of Proverbs. It's probably my favorite book in the Bible, certainly of the Old Testament. King Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs. He was considered to be an extremely wise king. And Proverbs is exactly that, a collection of very wise sayings. And this one is probably my favorite, Proverbs 3, 5, 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. I was blaming God, certainly. I was mad at him. I was mad at the very idea of God because something bad had happened to me. I was aware that bad things happen all the time, all over the world, but this bad thing was happening to me. This time, it was personal. But why blame God? Why acknowledge that this God I didn't even believe in had played any kind of role in this crime? I strongly believe it was because of my Christian friends, or at least because a Christian friend was nearby at the time. I was angry, and here was the culprit. Sean's all-loving, all-powerful God was responsible. He must have been. Who else would do such a thing? Now, I have had a lot of respect for my Christian friends. I guess I still do. They believed in God. They had devoted their lives to him, and because they were my friends, their beliefs and their devotion mattered to me. Even if I didn't agree with it, it was still important to me because they were important to me. But that also made them and their beliefs a target. In a moment where I was angry and frustrated and the deed was done with virtually no evidence left behind, I needed something and someone to blame. And my Christian friend was right there. God was right there. Easy pickings. So there's two important things I want you to take away from this part of my story. And the first is, God was getting involved in my life through my friends. He was using them to reveal himself. And their obedience allowed me to catch a glimpse of him. They weren't just a source of information about God. In this case, they were an outlet for me to begin questioning who God was and what he was all about. God got my attention by stealing my bike and making sure there was a Christian there at the time. The second thing is, I was starting to acknowledge God. This is the NIV translation. There's other translations that say, in all your ways, submit to him. I was not submitting to him. I was blaming him. I was calling him out as something bad and frustrating and meaningless. But he had my attention. Whatever my motivation, I was clearly focused on God in that moment. Now, full acknowledgement requires some response. Submission requires a response. For me, that would come several months later. But he definitely had my attention. I'm a big movie, especially Tarantino fan, so I actually wrote that line, he had my attention. Shauna's my editor, and she wrote in, "Why haven't you included the obvious Tarantino quote here?" So that's actually her. God gets the attention of all of us at some point. God is trying to get your attention right now. The response is up to you. But he's doing something. He has always been doing something to get your attention. And sometimes he does it by stealing. This is 1 Thessalonians 5:2. "For you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." There it is. I know it's completely out of context, but as I said, I didn't go to Bible school or even Sunday school, so God's a thief. It's in there. I want to clarify. God is worthy of our love and devotion and respect and worship and praise. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you can't still pick a fight with him. He will let you pick a fight with him. Just know he doesn't play fair. So the next part of my experience, God started playing unfair. First he steals, now he's playing unfair. He tricked me into becoming a Christian. I'll get to that. Now, the most unfair thing God has done in my life and has done in all our lives is to use his son, Jesus, in his attempts to get our attention and have us acknowledge him. Parents understand this. In fact, if you don't have kids, you understand this. Using your kids to get something from someone is sneaky and unfair and effective. Shauna said when she was little, her dad would take her to do the Christmas tree shopping out to the lot and to negotiate the price of the Christmas tree, and her dad would get her to go and negotiate with the salesman because she was cute and these big eyes and the smile, and she would get her way. She would totally get it. Not fair to the guy selling the trees, but effective. God uses his son in an unfair way to get our attention. But I want to talk to you first about the second most unfair thing God has ever done. He tricked me into becoming a Christian. Now, I had a lot of Christian friends growing up, actually. Most of my best friends in high school were Christian. I don't believe this was just a coincidence. This is another way that God was trying to get my attention. He did it through the people in my life. In my last year at high school, I worked at Arby's. There used to be an Arby's on 16th Avenue over by SAIT, if any of you remember that. It was a good job. I worked the drive-through. The people I worked with were really good. I could ride there on my now far inferior bike because God stole my good one. And one of the people who worked there was a girl from my school named Melissa, another Christian friend. And one day she invited me to something called tech. Now, I was in drama classes in high school, and I thought tech was like TECH, like that she was inviting me to some kind of stage production event. She said it was tech, TEC, Teens Encounter Christ. And that put me off immediately. On one hand, she was my friend, and she was inviting me to this weekend retreat. She said it would be a lot of fun, but she also said Christ. I immediately started looking for a polite way to say no. So I asked when it was. She said, it's on the Thanksgiving long weekend in October. perfect. My family has always celebrated Thanksgiving on the long weekend in October. At the time, my sister was living out of town, and she would always come into town for Thanksgiving, and our family would come together on that weekend. Always, always. Sorry, Melissa, I can't go. It's our family's Thanksgiving weekend, but thanks for inviting me. And she said, well, if you're not having Thanksgiving this year, will you go? We always have Thanksgiving, always. So it's not even worth having the conversation. But what if you don't this year? Will you go? I figured this was an easy out. Sure, okay, yeah, fine. If we're not having Thanksgiving this year, I'll go to tech. I went home. My mom called me. I didn't call her. I didn't tell her what was going. She called me that night. Oh, hey, Tom, by the way, your sister's not going to be able to make it into town for Thanksgiving, so we're going to do it the week after. Hope that's okay. Click. Unfortunately, God had given me something in my life at the time called integrity, and I somehow felt compelled to remain true to that. So the next day, Melissa came up, so are you having Thanksgiving with your family? No. So you're going to go to tech? Yes. So I went to tech. God used my own integrity against me. Now, one of the activities that tech put on during the evening when it was dark was called Stations of the Cross. Some of you may have heard of this. It's like a dramatic reproduction of the events leading up to Jesus being arrested and nailed to the cross. So a small group of us were led outside. We followed a guide who was dressed like he was from biblical times, and we just followed and watched. We would walk for several minutes through the trees and the dark, and we'd come upon scene after scene showing these events, right from the books of the gospel. Same words, same story. Jesus praying with his friends in the garden in the early hours before dawn. Jesus being betrayed by Judas and handed over to the Roman guards. Jesus being tried in front of Pontius Pilate, who declares that Jesus has done nothing wrong, and yet the crowd I was in, began yelling, "Crucify him!" As we'd been walking, more people dressed in robes had joined our group, had joined our crowd to make it feel more like we were part of that crowd. So when they started yelling, "Crucify him," I felt like I was yelling too. It was a very personal and powerful experience. We witnessed the beating and torture of Jesus, just moments ago declared innocent. We saw him carry his own cross, and finally we saw him give up his life on that cross for us, for me. God doesn't play fair. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, to pay for our sins. That's not fair. He provided a way for us to spend eternity in heaven with him, despite our failings, despite all the mean, selfish, hurtful things that we've done. How is that fair? God continues day after day to try and get our attention, despite our attempts to ignore him or do things on our own, when we rarely call on him or just go through the motions and treat him like he's the last thing on our list of priorities. He still loves us, he still seeks us out, and he sends people to remind us that he's there and he wants us to acknowledge him. That's not fair. Thank God he's not fair. I listened to a lot of Newsboys when I became a Christian. I wrote, "They are a fairly popular Christian pop band," and of course Shauna edited and wrote out, "They were a fairly popular Christian pop band," I guess. So they actually have a song called "Real Good Thing," and I think the chorus sums it up beautifully. When we get what we don't deserve, that's a real good thing. And when we don't get what we deserve, that's a real good thing. During my tech weekend, my encounter with Christ, I was about to get what I didn't deserve. After the Stations of the Cross, we went back to this little fireside room, and there were a few musicians playing guitars and people singing quiet songs of worship. I didn't know what worship was, but they were singing. It was a small group. There was no talking. No one was playing on their cell phone. It was 1993, so there were no cell phones. It was just a quiet, peaceful time to reflect on what we had just witnessed. One of the girls who was singing had her eyes closed, and she was singing to someone I couldn't see. She was fully engaged in her worship. She wasn't performing. She wasn't just singing because that's what she was supposed to be doing. She was having a very real, very personal experience with her God. It was totally authentic. It was real. And in that moment, I realized I had to respond. I went back to my sleeping bag that night at the end of the evening, and I said my first prayer. And I remember the exact words. I said, God, if you're real, I need to know. And if you're real, I need to change. I woke up the next morning a Christian, and I told no one. I learned later that my friend Melissa and a number of other people who I didn't know had been praying for me and for all the other teens that were attending, and they were freaking out because I guess after that morning it appeared like I just stopped caring that there was anything going on. To them it looked like I was just sitting there waiting for the weekend to be over. Of course, I'm processing this monumental change that's just happened in my life and just continuing to absorb the incredible and unconditional love that the people at this weekend were showing me and the other teens. There's this point in the weekend called reconciliation, which is basically a time for people to respond to what they'd experienced over the weekend. Again, quiet music, very little talking, people going up for prayer, lots of tears and hugging, and people responding to and connecting with Jesus. And I just sat there through it all. And Melissa and her friends thought I was hating every moment of it. What they didn't know is I'd already responded and on that first night. My first prayer was my response. Instead of just taking it in, gaining knowledge and understanding of who Jesus is and what he did, I had to do something. In that moment of my prayer, I chose to trust God with all my heart, to acknowledge him, and to submit to him. It boggles my mind when I consider how intricately involved God has been in my life. He brought me from an atheist household to saying my first prayer over 23 years ago. And in that moment, when I finally, fully, freely trusted him and stated my desire to acknowledge him in all my ways. And since that day, my paths have been all over the place. I mean, not to discredit King Solomon here, but since giving my life to Jesus, I've been on a roller coaster. I've had doubts about God. I've been angry with God. I've fallen on my knees in utter amazement at how great and loving Jesus has been. My path has not been straight. But it doesn't say path, does it? It says paths, plural. There are so many different ways we go in life, so many different choices and possibilities continuing to take place every day. Sometimes it feels like life is pulling us in countless different directions, starting out one way and then taking a sudden turn. But by trusting him, by acknowledging him, he has made the paths of my life continue to lead to him, straight to him. Every time I return my focus to Jesus and actively choose to trust in him and acknowledge him, respond to him, he takes the paths of my life, whatever's going on, and points them straight toward him. Think about all the different things that have led to you being here this morning. And I don't just mean how you came to manifest, but what events and decisions have happened in your life to bring you to this moment. A moment that focuses on Jesus. God trying to get your attention right now. I got here because of the people in my life, because of God working through them to get my attention. But it was up to me to acknowledge that message and respond in some way. If you're here this morning, or you're listening to this on a podcast or watching it online, forward thinking, and you don't believe in God, someone led you here, something led you here. Maybe you were tricked into coming. He does that. Whatever the reason, it's very likely that the people in your life pointed the way. Even if you simply found out about Manifest through a Google search, it's likely there was someone at some point in your life that had a part in planting a seed that made you start looking. And if you were led here, then you have an opportunity to respond. If you do believe in Jesus, you're here this morning because you want to worship him and learn more about him and continue to strengthen your faith. That's awesome. And it means you have a responsibility. Whose life are you in that needs to have that seed planted? Who needs to be in your life? At Manifest, we have these three parts of a pathway: connect, invest, invite. Who do you need to invite? And again, not just necessarily to Manifest, but who do you need to invite into your life? Who needs to simply see and hear and know what you believe? And don't assume they don't want to know or they're not interested. Let them say no. One of the things Brad spoke about last week was making sure we have the right people in our lives to tell us what we need to hear instead of just what we want to hear. Well, we also have to be those people in others' lives. We have to be there to listen when their bikes get stolen. If you already believe, the invitation is up to you. If you don't believe, the response is up to you. God's a thief. He wants to steal away from you all the things that distract you from his love. Jesus wants to take away anything that is getting in the way of you seeing him. He'll do anything to get your attention. In my case, he stole my bike, and I am so thankful for that. God does not play fair. He lived the perfect life we couldn't and gave us the credit. Not fair. He died for our sins, paid the price for our wrongs. Not fair. He defeated sin and death and provides a way for us to, despite our flaws and screw-ups, to spend eternity with him. Not fair. Shauna often likes to say, fair isn't everyone getting the same thing. Fair is each person getting what they need. We all need God's grace, and we all need Jesus in order to receive that grace. If you want to acknowledge him, finally, to submit to him and recognize that he's been trying to get your attention, if you want to change, knowing he's real, knowing what Jesus has done for you because he loves you, and I urge you to respond this morning. You can do that by coming and praying with myself or Brad over here after the service, or with a person who brought you. Respond. God's trying to get your attention. Right now, God's either trying to get your attention or he's trying to use you to get someone else's attention. The next step is up to you.